So today we're talking about hiring for EQ, how to not only select people with higher emotional intelligence, but how to train those folks, since I think the vast majority of this room is training professionals in one sense or another. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So we'll talk about EQ, set a foundation for some of you. We'll talk about how you hire, and I'm going to give you some specific questions you can ask, so be prepared to take some notes. We'll talk about EQ in teams and why that's important. And finally, I want to leave you with tools, tips, and training techniques that you can use. Emotional intelligence. Now, I purposely use this graphic. So some of you may have seen the iceberg graphic where IQ was on the top, EQ was on the bottom, right? It's been around for years. And the reason that graphic was so popular is because we thought, okay, your IQ, your intellectual intelligence is what people see, right? And EQ is your hidden behaviors that drive, what drives your behavior is your EQ, which is under the waterline. That is not true at all, actually. Emotional intelligence shows up every single day in our behavior. So it is not just below the waterline, it is at the very top as well. So it's everywhere. Okay, so a little quiz for you just to get started. Who do you think said this quote, "Emotion is more powerful than logic"? Albert Einstein. Now, why would you guess that? I love the quote because he is a man who's the icon for IQ, right? But he said, emotion is more powerful than logic. So those are some powerful words there. Okay, so what is emotional intelligence? Here's the formal definition. It's a set of emotional and social skills that collectively establish how well we perceive and express ourselves, how we develop and maintain our relationships, how we cope with challenges and make decisions, and how we use that information to guide our thinking and action. So yes, it is your people skills, but it's more than your people skills. It's also how you take risks, how you manage your impulses, how you manage stress, how you make decisions, and a whole host of other things. So it is your people skills, but a whole lot more as well. And as most of you probably know, EQ has been around for 3 decades now. And there's been significant links established to show that it's a significant driver of success in work, life, and in leadership. Okay, so understanding the whole person. So a combination is what makes up the real you, the whole you. So you have your IQ, which is your ability to learn. Your IQ is usually set by late teens, and it remains relatively stable our entire lives. So your IQ really doesn't change that much. Even if you study encyclopedias, you go take a Mensa exam, it's not going to change a whole lot. Your personality is your core personality that you're born with. Your extroversion, your introversion, your thinking, your feeling. Those are your preferences or your style. That is fixed. So if you are an extroverted thinker, it's unlikely you're going to become an introverted feeler later on in life. We usually don't change our core personality traits. However, emotional intelligence does change. We can change our behaviors, and the good news for all of us is emotional intelligence increases as we age. So you will all become more emotionally intelligent as you age, right? So, yay! That's right, Frank. Something to look forward to. So I'll give you, I mean, you can't say that about many things, right? Now, it's not a guaranteed, of course. We have to learn from our behaviors. We have to have awareness, and we have to put some effort into it to get better at it. But for the vast majority of people, you will improve your EQ. So I'll give you a couple of examples here. We tend to become more empathetic as we age. We tend to become more socially responsible as we age. We tend to care about others more, frankly, than when we're younger. We get better at managing our impulses. We get better at managing our stress levels. So those are just a few examples of why your EQ improves as you accumulate more life experiences. Okay, so why care about emotional intelligence? It's responsible for 58% of job performance. That's been established. So let's talk about your pocketbook. People who are higher in EQ make $29,000 more than their lower EQ counterparts. Having this knowledge for yourself and your team is the first step to self-awareness. Self-awareness has been shown to be the most important attribute for success. And finally, knowledge and relationships are the currency of the new economy. So I'll explain what I mean here. So Thomas Friedman, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning publicist for the, no, not publicist, but columnist for the New York Times. He wrote a book called The World is Flat several years ago. Fascinating book. So what he talks about in this book is that we live on a level playing field now because of the internet and technology. So what information you can access, the same person in rural India or rural China or in Indonesia can access the exact same information. So we're on a level playing field. So because of that, because of our advancements, there's someone in another country who can perform your skills that you do in your role faster, better, or cheaper. And that's a reality. So the only way for you to maintain a competitive advantage in work and in life is the quality of your relationships. And that is your emotional intelligence. So that's why it's so important. And finally, there's a saying, hired on IQ, fired on EQ. So we're hired based on quantitative data for the most part. Your resume, right? It's the number of years you worked, it's the number of awards you won, it's your accomplishments, it's your degrees. It's quantitative data. But how well you get along and play in the sandbox with others is going to determine how far you go in your careers. But today, we are going to talk about how you hire on EQ. All right, so this is through Multi-Health System. It's the EQI 2.0 model. There are 5 major categories: self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal relationships, decision-making, and stress management. Those are categories. Within each of those 5 categories, you have three competencies within each category for a total of 15 EQ competencies. So we're going to be talking about these today. This is why I want to show this slide. There are a couple other EQ models out there that are also commercially available and popular, Talent Smart and the Goldman ESCI model. And there's a couple others. They're not as popular in the US, but those are the 3 main big commercial ones. So this is the one I'll be referring to today. Okay, so let's talk about the hiring piece. So how can you hire people who are high in emotional intelligence, right? First, I want to share a study with you. So this is a study through leadershipiq.com. It's a 3-year study that was done in 8,000 employees in over 5,000 companies. So 500 companies, excuse me. So thousands of people were studied, multiple countries. And what they found is that 46% of newly hired employees will fail within the first 18 months. So that means only 19% will ultimately achieve success. Those are people who are newly hired. That's a pretty high failure rate, right? In any business. If you have nearly a 50% failure rate. So let's take a closer look at that. Why did these new hires fail? 26% of new hires failed because they couldn't accept feedback or coaching. That is EQ related. 23% failed because they're unable to understand and manage their emotions. That's also EQ related. 17% failed because they lack the necessary motivation to excel and do the job. That's EQ related. And 15% failed because they have the wrong temperament for the job environment or a lack of self-awareness. So top 4, so roughly 90% of the reasons for failure is EQ related. And what's fascinating about this is only 11% fail because of their lack of technical skills. Right? That's pretty powerful data. So let's take a deeper look at this. So bias, you've all familiar with bias. You've heard the term unconscious bias. So unconscious bias, hidden bias, and implicit bias are all the same things, same terms. They're synonymous with each other. So bias in the workplace is very real, and it is problematic because it affects how we interact with each other and how we make decisions. Bias actually gets introduced during the interview. So let's say you're a hiring manager. You're sitting behind your desk, the candidate walks in. What are you doing right away?
Checking them out.
You're sizing, that's right, you're checking them out, you're sizing them up right away. Within 30 to 60 seconds, we make impressions about people. Now, we naturally do this because we're trying to make connections, okay? And that's a good thing, trying to make connections. But we're also relying on our biases. that's inherent in us that we may or may not be aware of. So for example, if someone walks in who's similar to you in age, maybe the same gender, maybe you went to the same graduate school, you're automatically going to have preferences for them. We tend to be attracted to people that look and act like we do. So be aware of that. Is during the interview, that's often when bias gets introduced into the process. So just to be aware of any biases you may have. Differentiate between style and substance. Another way to put this is the steak and the sizzle. Right? You got to focus on the steak, not the sizzle. So steak or substance is, I'll start with the lower one. It's the technical and the functional or EQ skills that they actually have. The sizzle or the style may be how they're dressed. It may be their firm handshake and their eye contact with you. It may be that they're a fantastic interviewer. It may be that they have a great energy level and you really like that. That's style traits. Focus more on the substance. And like your mom always told you, still true, you can't judge a book by its cover. So there's a few things to keep in mind when you sit down to interview. So behavioral interviewing is highly recommended. How many of you use behavioral interviewing in your organizations? Okay, most of you, not overwhelmingly though. So let's talk a little bit about this. So behavioral interviewing is a structured format of an interview where you ask open-ended questions that are job related. You may have heard of STAR or SBO. So the STAR format is what's the situation or task, that's the S, ST. The A is what action did you take, and R is what result, what was the result. SBO, just another acronym. It means what's the situation, what was the behavior that they took on, and what was the outcome. So either one, STAR or SBO. So those are types of behavioral interviewing. Past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So if you're asking open-ended behavioral type questions and you're probing down, you're going to get stories that's going to tell you their level of emotional intelligence. Also, ask questions about what did you do, not what would you do. We often ask without even thinking, what would you do in this situation? So we give them a hypothetical, right? Good candidates like this format of interviewing because it allows them to focus on their accomplishments. And it's harder for poor candidates to fake it through. Okay, so this is a case study from L'Oreal. It's actually been cited many times. It's in organizational behavior textbooks. It's a great case for emotional intelligence. So what L'Oreal did is they actually assessed a pool of candidates. So they had EQ scores to go on. So what they did is they started selecting people on the basis of their EQ scores. And they found that they had 63% less turnover for candidates that were selected based on EQ scores versus those who were not, through the traditional methods, who were not selected based on EQ. But it translated into revenue. The net revenue increase was over $2.5 million more for L'Oreal from this EQ group. On average, each salesperson generated $91,000 more than people who were not hired using EQ scores. So the main message there is that majority of the reasons that we succeed or fail in a job, it's emotional intelligence related. So it speaks to the importance of hiring for emotional intelligence and training on emotional intelligence because it helps people perform better in their jobs. Remember I showed you there's 15 EQ competencies? These are the 5 that have been identified as most important on the job. So this is from Daniel Goleman's Working with Emotional Intelligence, which is actually quite old now, but came out in 1998. Been around a long time. This is also, what I did is I cross-reference Goleman's data with data from multi-health systems. Dr. Steven Stein has a book on emotional intelligence. And I also cross-referenced it with EQ, Emotional Intelligence 2.0. So I looked at 3 different EQ companies and cross-referenced this. And these are the 5 common skills, EQ skills, that have been cited as most important on the job. Now, one important thing is these are general to all industries. Now, when you look at specific industries, the EQ skills will vary. So for example, If you're in accounting, the EQ skills you need for accounting may be independence. It might be flexibility, maybe your top scores. If you're hiring for a sales position, interpersonal skills may be your number one EQ skill that you look for. If you're hiring for customer service role, empathy may be the number one EQ skill that you look for. So it is industry and job specific, but these are the 5 that in general has been identified as most important. So let's take a look. Self-awareness. So this is how someone understands their own feelings, behaviors, and what motivates them. So how does it look in practice? So this is someone would be in touch with how they are perceived by others. So they'd be aware of that. Aware of their strengths and weaknesses. They would recognize how their feelings affect them, others, and their own performance. And they'd have likely have candor and a sense of humor as well. So those are some key hallmarks, key indicators of someone who's high in self-awareness. Okay, so I'm going to give you some suggested questions that you can ask to tease out self-awareness in your interview process. Here we go. And you might want to write this down. Here's a general question. Describe a time when you felt you were unfairly criticized and how you handled it. Now, there are a number of different questions you can ask related to self-awareness. This is just one example for you. But just this simple question is going to tell you a wealth of information. A time when you felt you were unfairly criticized, so that speaks to how self-aware they were of the situation and their perceptions of the situation, and also how you handled it. So that's going to give you a sense of the outcome and how their method towards solving the problem. So it's going to tell you a lot. And remember, even for these questions, you could still drill down on, tell me more. What was the finding? Or, and then what happened? So those are just great little phrases that you can use to probe a little further. Impulse control. So impulse control is our ability to manage our impulses, to say or do inappropriate things even when the urge is strong. I'm sure there's all been times when you've experienced a lack of impulse control for yourself or in your colleagues, right? You've seen this, you've experienced it. So what does it look in action? People are able to think before they act, and even today, that is still rampant. People still do not think before they act. In general, our leadership is still very short term. We don't think long term, and that needs to change. People who are high in impulse control consider the negative effects of their impulsive behavior. They manage their feelings constructively instead of letting them dominate and undermine their performance, and they deal well with ambiguity. So, keeping that in mind, here's a question that you could ask. We've all had to bite our tongue at times. Tell me about the last time it happened to you. So I love this question because up front, you're actually being empathetic, right? Up front, and you're making a connection with them. Hey, we've all done it. We've all been there. We've had to bite our tongues. But tell me a time it's happened to you. And again, you're looking for that structured behavioral response. What was the situation? What did they do? What was their action, their thought process? And then what was the result or outcome? Let's move on to the next EQ skill that's shown to be important on the job, empathy. And I'm actually very happy to see this consistent across the different EQ models. And that's because empathy has been shown to be a key EQ skill that is lacking in most leaders. They lack empathy. So it's being able to relate to and read the emotions of others and respond in a way that's most appropriate. How does it look demonstrated? So folks high in empathy would recognize that they must frame the message differently depending on their audience. So that actually is an empathy skill. You may have thought of that as an interpersonal skill or a communication skill, but the ability to read someone else and then tailor your message specifically is a hallmark of empathy. These folks would also initiate effective collaboration by understanding the makeup of their team. They would consider others' feelings in their decision making. And finally, they would select the most appropriate means of communication. So some people prefer email, some prefer texting, some prefer face-to-face, some prefer phone calls. So if you're empathetic and you're in tune to others' needs, you would also tailor communication preferences. So we communicate in our own preference. So if you prefer emailing, how do you think you're going to communicate with others? You're going to email. What if you have a young millennial or even Gen Z now entering the workforce on your team, and they want to text, right? So you're not playing to their preferences. What if you have a baby boomer on your team and they prefer get up, walk down the hall, and have that face-to-face conversation, right? They may not prefer email. So it's knowing those differences and adjusting accordingly. That's empathy. So here's a suggested interview question for you. Describe a time when you were able to adapt to a person from a different background or culture. Now, I've added this question because of diversity. We are more diverse as a global society every single day. So this is a really important question to ask, because surely they have experienced or worked with people from different cultures or backgrounds, and this will help tease out your sense of that. Okay, let's move on to stress tolerance. It's the ability to handle our levels of stress coming from multiple sources. So how does it look demonstrated is we would handle those levels of stress without losing our productivity or our effectiveness. We'd be able to think and speak clearly in emotionally charged situations. We can handle a hostile person without lashing out back at them. And we would stay composed, positive, and unflappable even in trying moments. So I'm sure all of you do this all the time, right? Perfectly, right? Every situation, every day, piece of cake, right? So this is a particularly important EQ skill today because we are busier than we've ever been. We are juggling multiple things every day. So how we manage our stress is important, and it's definitely important on the job. So here's a suggested question for you to help assess the level of stress tolerance. Everybody has times when they feel stress on the job. Give me an example of a situation that stressed you out the most, and what did you do about it? So there's several key components to this. Again, you're connecting with them up front. Everyone feels stress. Give me an example of what stressed you out. Now, most is an important qualifier here, because if you just ask them what stressed you out, well, there's a number of things they could say, but you want to know what stressed them out the most. So you want them to focus in. And again, this is going to help tease out those rehearsed answers. Okay, and then what did you do about it? How did that work for you? What was the outcome? How did it affect you? How did it affect your team and your colleagues? So there's a number of questions you can ask as a follow-on to probe deeper. Finally, flexibility is critically important. In today's workforces, you all know we're fast-paced, we're highly matrixed, we're cross-functional, and we're global. So in order to keep up with all that, flexibility is a key emotional intelligence skill. So it's our ability to handle changing circumstances and expectations without disruption. How does it look in practice? These folks would be open-minded to new ideas, able to multitask effectively. They can easily adjust and transition to change, and anticipates, understands, and addresses changing needs. So again, I'm sure you're all perfect in this, right? This is critical, especially these. I purposely use change here a lot because we as organizations today are going through multiple changes constantly. Downsizing, mergers and acquisitions, layoffs, restructuring. There's constant change going on now. So this is a key skill. And I'm sure you have either experienced it yourself or noticed it in your colleagues or people who are not embracing a change, right? They dig their heels in. They don't want to go along with a new plan. They want it the way it used to be. So this is a critical skill to hire for. So here's a suggested question for you. What was a significant change made in your organization that they're coming from in the last 6 months that directly affected you? How did it affect you, and what did you do to make adjustments? So this one is multiple parts, and it's going to give you a lot of information about how they manage their flexibility. 6 months is important because if you just say, give me an example of a change effort that affected you, they could give you an example from 5 years ago. But you want to know in the last 6 months, and guarantee they will have gone through some type of organizational change in the last 6 months. So you're narrowing it down. How did it affect you, not the organization? I've heard oftentimes in interviews, they will respond by saying, we went through a restructuring and my team was really disengaged and we had a hard time with change. Okay, that's well and good, but I want to know about you. How did it affect you? And what did you do to make adjustments? So just that question alone is going to tell you a lot of information about their flexibility skills. So let's talk about emotional intelligence and teams. Most of our work today is done in teams, in most organizations. Okay, so the brain seeks safety. This slide's formatted a little different, but I'll walk you through it. So safety is an acronym that stands for security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, trust, and the Y stands for you. So this is an acronym that the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership has come up with. And basically, what they've shown in their work is that neuroscience and brain-based leadership studies have proven the positive impact on job performance when people are working with colleagues and leaders who have high emotional intelligence. So the brain functions much more efficiently when we're not threatened, when we don't have social and emotional threats. So that's the safety model. But the take home here is there's brain studies, there's brain probes, there's situational assessment, there's testing that's been done to show that in order to perform well on the job, you have to feel psychologically safe. And if you are in a team that's higher in emotional intelligence, you will feel psychologically safe and that team will perform better, basically. Because, and I'm going to give you some examples here, because they have a sense of fairness, they have a sense of security. They have trust in their teammates. Okay, so I'll give you some examples. So high EQ teams are easy to spot. You have high levels of trust because they due to respectful and transparent discussions. You have confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject you, or punish people for speaking up. You see a team that's committed to honest communication, dialogue, and discussion. Individual contributors respect and support the talents of others on the team. High levels of interpersonal competency and risk-taking is something you would see. You obviously be able to see that on teams. As far as conflict, they wouldn't avoid conflict. They would welcome it and embrace it. So they would leverage conflict to make decisions, and tough issues would actually be brought up on the table to discuss. You would also see group norms established that promote collaboration. And diversity would be embraced, and people would have a sense of belonging on the team. Now, it doesn't stop there. There's more. You would also see empathy. They would care about each other. They care about if each other does well. They're interested in each other personally. You would realize that success comes from interdependence. So in other words, they're not thinking, well, I drive this team. They know that in order for them to be successful, they have to rely on their teammates. They don't let ego or individual accomplishments stand in the way of the overall team results. Members accept responsibility for their actions, and they know how their actions affects the team. They share credit for successes and for failures. So the finger pointing that we often see is minimal or non-existent. They would seek open and constructive feedback from their teammates, hold each other accountable to deliver results, and finally, you would see high integrity, which would assure engagement and performance. So there's lots of signs. They're everywhere, actually. There's lots of signs of teams that are high in EQ. But do you think you can spot a team's low in EQ? Oh, yeah. Let's look at low EQ teams. I bet you've never seen these. Fits and starts with successes followed by dysfunction and crisis mode. Issues are left unresolved and cause distrust in relationships. Again, now your finger pointing is going on. Shifting blame, taking credit for the team's successes. Avoiding conflict. Relationship infighting, destructive discontent. Lack of group norms and collaboration. Working in silos and not seeking feedback from the other teams. I'm still amazed how often this still occurs today. even with the emphasis on teams and collaboration and, there's still so many organizations that work in silos and do not share feedback or successes. Okay, there's more. Lack of or poor communication amongst the team. Posturing individual strengths and accomplishments over the team cohesiveness. So basically, promoting your own accomplishments and disregarding the accomplishments of your teammates. Little empathy or interest in one another. So you would see lack of caring. Insecurity and lack of direction cause them to stay in the status quo. So that's a really important point. What's this going to affect, this one here? You got it. Whoever said that. Innovation. Innovation is going to be impacted by this. And we see it all the time, don't we? Because of the insecurity, so going back to that safety model, the security is not there. They don't trust their teammates. So because of that, they're holding on, they're not sharing information, and they're just maintaining the status quo. They're not thinking outside the box and looking for innovative and creative solutions. They tend to stick to the rules without thinking outside the box, and team members prefer to stay below the radar and do the minimum effort without ever reaching for what could be possible. So these couldn't be more different, and they're obvious differences, right? So that speaks to the importance of emotional intelligence on our teams. All right, so some tools, tips, and training here. So I would like to share a few tools with you. The 3x2 grid outlines what skills you are specifically looking for that specific role you're interviewing for. So you're parsing out what are the must-haves and the nice-to-haves. So you have to know what you're seeking, first of all. The questionnaire is developing 2 or 3 questions around each of these EQ skills that you identify in your grid, or perhaps even the 5 skills we've talked about today. So it's just coming up with maybe 2 or 3 questions. Now, chances are you're not going to use every question in the interview. But if you have a couple questions for each EQ competency you're interested in, that will help you prepare for the interview. And then finally, the interview evaluation is a standard rubric. If you don't have one already that you're using in your organizations, it's a standard rubric that you can use to assess the candidate on the EQ skills. Okay, so here's an example of the 3x2 grid. On the left column here is your 3, so your education and experience. So what's required? What's the must-have? What's the nice-to-have? The must-have, they must have a bachelor's degrees or perhaps a master's degrees for that particular role. So that's their education and experience, your education and experience requirements. Technical skills, what do they need to do the job from a technical perspective? It could be computer skills, it could be clinical skills, it could be writing skills or communication skills. So what technical skills do you need? Now, those are going to be based off of your job description, right? So make sure your job description is up to date as well. And then this last category that's starting to fade off here says functional or emotional intelligence skills. So what key EQ skills do you need for that specific role? Now again, this is going to depend on what industry you're in and what role you're hiring for. Again, if it's a sales versus accounting versus customer service versus manufacturing, it's going to vary. So let's say here, the example, integrity. Integrity is a must-have. And let's say you need flexibility as another must-have. And so you could have 3 or 4 key EQ skills that you're looking for. Think of the must-have column also as these skills can't be taught. You need people with these skills inherent in them. So that's your must-have. The nice-to-have column, think of this as skills that can be taught. Perhaps they can learn on the job. Perhaps they can get better at their assertiveness, for example. So it's a great tool to help you lay out what you're looking for. Now, if you don't know, ask colleagues, ask the leadership team, perhaps even the customers for that role, what's been successful in the past. So what's really helped a person be successful in that role and not successful in that role. So that'll help you with your grid. So here's the second tool is the questionnaire. Again, create 2 or 3 questions for each item listed in your grid. Make sure your panel agrees with the items in your grid and revise if needed. Make sure everyone knows which items they'll be interviewing for. So that's a great, a nice tip there, because as the interviewer, and I'm going to go back a second here, it's going to be a long interview if you're asking behavioral questions for each of these, right? So ideally, you would have an interview panel, and people would have different roles. So let's say someone asks questions around the top 2 EQ skills. Maybe someone asks questions around the technical skills. Maybe someone else asks questions about their background and experience. So make sure the panel is okay with those skills. Focus mostly on the functional or EQ skills, and focus on the must-have column as priority. And you might even want to tailor a few questions specifically to the candidate's resume itself. During the interview, here's some tips for you. Take notes. I'm surprised still how many hiring managers do not take notes. Ask probing questions. So I've been mentioning these throughout the talk, but here's some examples. Tell me more. Then what happened? What was the outcome? And there's others that you can ask. Listen carefully. I know that sounds like an obvious, but a lot of the time we are waiting to speak. We're not actively listening. We're just waiting for our turn to speak, even as a hiring manager. So make sure you're actively listening and taking notes. Try and be poker-faced if you can, and encourage complete answers, and make sure you leave some time at the end for them to ask questions. So here's an example of the evaluation. So this is after the interview, and it's the standard rubric that I mentioned. So here you have your functional or EQ skills listed, and then a 5-point Likert scale. How did the candidate do from 1 to 5? And if you don't have this, it's a nice tool that you could create. You could easily create, and then make sure everyone on the interview panel is using the same tool that you can compare notes. And even something like that is not used consistently in a lot of organizations today. So make sure you're all on the same page, and this helps to have consistent and objective, hopefully objective, assessment of your candidates. Okay, and lastly, I want to leave you with training, since you are training professionals. How can you improve these 5 key skills? Self-awareness. One suggestion for you is to have a frank discussion with someone close to you about how you display emotions and when they are appropriate and inappropriate. And again, most people don't get enough feedback, so it's critically important to ask. If you feel like you're not getting feedback, ask. Your loved ones, your close colleagues, even if you have a great relationship with your boss, ask to make sure you check in. We often don't know. Most people do not know how they're perceived. So that's one example for you. By the way, there's tons of examples I've laid out for all the EQ competencies in the book. I'm just giving you one here for just to get you thinking. Okay, for impulse control, here's a suggestion for you to improve the skill. Are you a perfectionist? Lack of control occurs when things don't go as we plan. So put some slack in your plans and try to think of worst case scenarios. And ask yourself something. When you're starting to feel, that you want to act to impulses, what's the worst thing that can happen here? As far as empathy, don't judge, don't give advice, and don't interrupt. Now this one, I actually have to say I like this one a lot. Let people say what's on their mind, and they'll feel, I purposely use that word, they will feel that you're empathetic. Okay, let's say empathy is not your strong point. It's okay, it's okay. It's something we can work on, right? It improves with age. But if it's not your strong point, if you don't interrupt them, don't try and give advice, let them talk, they will report that you were empathetic, even if you aren't naturally. So it's a great strategy that works. And then stress tolerance, do someone a favor. It allows you to shift from being a problem sufferer to a problem solver, and I love this one. It helps put your problems in perspective. And that's the case with anything, right? If you help someone else, your problems are not going to seem so terrible. So that's something we can do there. And finally, flexibility. Self-awareness is the key to our flexibility skills. Anytime you see yourself being inflexible, push yourself to be more open to new ideas and use a what-if mindset. What if I did this? I'm feeling resistance to it now, but what if? So there's a suggestion for you. Okay, and finally, as training professionals, you play a significant role here. You can train hiring managers and HR on how to interview for EQ. using the structure and using what we talked about today. You also can train your new employees. So let's say they get hired. You can help train them on EQ, that point. And you can help train leadership on how to not only manage, but how to develop those higher EQ teams that we talked about. So training has an essential role. And then finally, I will leave you with this. So first of all, I would encourage you to connect with me. I'm more than happy to answer questions you may have on emotional intelligence, leadership, or gender, which is what the book is based on. So what you can't see up there is there's a free download that, if you're interested, is on my website. It's based on each chapter of the book. So I go through leadership. I looked at emotional intelligence and how it affects the perceptions of men and women in the workplace. And then I also looked at gender differences and how we show up differently in the workplace and how we can work together. So, and there's lots of strategies. So basically, the download is based on every chapter of the book. It's 108 questions, and they're self-reflection questions is what they are. So that's free on my website. And then with that, I will end it. So thank you guys. You've been a great audience today. And thank you.